In over 20 years of practicing neurology, I've witnessed the full spectrum of the human brain's resilience and fragility. I have seen tumors vanish after surgery, patients relearn speech after devastating strokes, and others fade quietly despite our best efforts. But one night in 2014, I came face to face with something that no textbook, no lecture, no experience could ever prepare me for. That night changed how I understood life, death, and everything in between. It was just past midnight when the emergency doors burst open. A man in his early 40s was wheeled in on a stretcher, his skin pale, his breathing shallow, a thin line of blood tracing down from his nose. His name was Arif. The paramedics shouted vitals, blood pressure crashing, pulse weak, pupils sluggish. I remember the scent of antiseptic and adrenaline filling the air as the team scrambled around him. I gave instructions without hesitation, though somewhere deep inside I knew this was going to be one of those battles we rarely win. The scans came back within minutes. A massive intracerebral hemorrhage had erupted deep within his brain. An artery had burst with violent force, flooding tissue that could no longer sustain life. I tried to explain it simply once to his family later. The brain is like a delicate city, and when one of its major bridges collapses, chaos ripples through every street. We rushed him into surgery. Time slowed as machines hummed, monitors beeped, and hands moved in perfect synchronization. But every minute felt heavier than the last. Hours passed. The bleeding would not stop. His intracranial pressure climbed beyond what life could endure. I remember the silence that filled the room when the final scan came up on the screen. No activity, no signs of consciousness. There was a moment when I looked at his face and saw not death, but an eerie calm, as though he were resting somewhere beyond our reach. When I stepped into the waiting room, his wife was sitting with her hands clasped tightly together, whispering prayers under her breath. Two small children leaned against her side, too young to understand the weight of what was about to be said. Delivering that kind of news never gets easier, no matter how many times you do it. I told her the truth in the softest way I could. Her cry cut through the sterile quiet of the hospital corridor, echoing down the hall. That sound still lingers in my memory. Back in the ICU, I signed the papers. Brain dead. No response to pain, no reflexes, no spontaneous breathing. The machines were turned off one by one. The room fell into complete stillness. Most doctors would have walked away at that point, and perhaps I should have. But I didn't. Something made me linger. I remember standing at the edge of his bed, looking at his face and feeling an unease I couldn't explain. He didn't look gone. There was something about him that resisted the finality of that word. I left the hospital at dawn, the sky still dark with the faintest tint of gray. I told myself to let it go, that sometimes medicine simply meets its limits. But deep down, I couldn't shake the thought that there was more to come. 36 hours later, Arif opened his eyes. Before that night, Arif was not just another name in a patient file. He was a man with a story, a life that pulsed with quiet dignity. He was 42 years old, a schoolteacher in a modest neighborhood, the kind of man everyone described as calm, patient, and endlessly kind. His students remembered his soft-spoken nature and the way he made even the most complex lessons feel simple. He was married for 15 years, a devoted husband and a father of 2 young children. His daughter used to say he had the gentlest eyes in the world. In every sense, he was an ordinary man until the night his life became something extraordinary. When I first met his family, it was long after the emergency, when his condition had stabilized in the ICU. His wife sat beside his bed, her eyes hollow but still searching for hope. She told me about the last few months, how Arif had been working late nights at school, grading exams, skipping meals, and complaining of dull headaches that would fade after a few painkillers. They thought it was exhaustion, maybe high blood pressure, nothing more. No one imagined that those small warnings were the first signs of something catastrophic brewing inside his skull. I remember watching her speak, her hands gripping the edge of the hospital blanket, as though holding it could somehow hold him in this world. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even pleading. She simply looked lost, as though time had frozen around her husband's still body. The children visited once, standing by the window, too afraid to come closer. Their eyes darted between their mother and the machines, unsure which to fear more. As I listened to her talk, I felt something shift inside me. In medicine, you're trained to build emotional distance, a barrier between empathy and survival. But there was something disarming about the way she spoke, about the love that lingered in her words even as she faced the possibility of loss. She told me how every morning Arif made tea for her before leaving for work, how he would pause by the doorway, smile, and whisper, "Be kind today." That small phrase stayed with me, echoing louder than the hum of the ventilator beside us. In reviewing his medical history, I found traces of silent warnings, a slightly elevated blood pressure reading here, a missed follow-up there. None of them catastrophic alone, but together they formed a quiet storm building beneath the surface. As a doctor, that realization always brings guilt. You wonder if you could have seen it sooner, if a few minutes of prevention might have rewritten the ending. I often tell myself medicine is about science, not destiny, but standing in that room, I couldn't help questioning both. Outside the hospital, life moved on, buses roared past, students laughed on sidewalks. The world continued unaware that inside those walls, A family's entire existence hung in limbo. For his wife, those hours felt endless, the space between prayer and surrender growing smaller with every passing minute. For me, it was a reminder that behind every case number is a heartbeat, a history, and a web of love that science can measure in no chart. None of us, not his wife, not his children, not even me, could have imagined what was waiting beyond that silence. Arif's story, I thought, had ended in that room. I couldn't have been more wrong. His story was only beginning. It was a Wednesday morning, ordinary in every visible way. Arif stood before his classroom of restless teenagers, chalk in hand, explaining a passage from a history book. Outside, sunlight spilled through dusty windows. Inside, a few students fought sleep while others scribbled in notebooks. It was a scene so mundane that no one could have imagined it would turn into something unforgettable within seconds. As he spoke, mid-sentence, Arif's hand froze. The chalk slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a faint tap. His other hand reached for his head, his expression twisting with sudden, unbearable pain. One of his students later said it looked like his eyes lost their focus, like he was staring at something far away. Then he collapsed. The classroom erupted in chaos. Students screamed, chairs toppled over, a few rushed toward him while others bolted into the hallway calling for help. His body jerked once, then went completely still. Within minutes, the school nurse arrived, followed by paramedics who worked swiftly, their calm voices breaking through the panic. No pulse. Wait, weak pulse. Let's move! The siren wailed as they lifted him into the ambulance, his face ashen, a smear of chalk dust still clinging to his sleeve. By the time I saw him in the emergency room, his pupils were dilated, his breathing shallow. A CT scan confirmed what I had feared from the moment he arrived. A catastrophic intracerebral hemorrhage, one of the most devastating types of brain bleed. In simple terms, a vessel deep inside his brain had ruptured, flooding the surrounding tissue with blood and choking off the oxygen that keeps neurons alive. I explained it to his wife later as gently as I could. The brain is like a city, its blood vessels like highways. One of those highways had burst open, and now the entire network was in gridlock. We rushed him into the operating theater. Every second mattered. The surgical lights flared bright as the team assembled. I can still recall the rhythm of that moment, the metallic clink of instruments, the measured tone of the anesthesiologist, the focused silence that falls over a room when every person knows they are standing between life and death. We worked for hours, draining the blood, relieving the pressure, trying to restore even a flicker of activity. But the damage was too deep, too sudden. Each reading on the monitor was worse than the one before. As the surgery ended, I stood back, feeling the weight of that silence pressing on my chest. The bleeding had slowed, but the cost was devastating. The parts of his brain that governed consciousness, movement, even breath, were no longer functioning. We connected him to life support and waited. Hours turned into a day. There was no improvement, no reflexes, no signs of response. When I finally told his family, the words came slowly. There's no electrical activity. His brain has stopped communicating with his body. They looked at me as if I were speaking another language. His wife shook her head, repeating softly, "He was fine this morning." And that was true. He had been fine until the moment he wasn't. That night, I stayed late in the ICU. The machines hummed in steady rhythm, their sounds familiar yet unbearable. I watched the lines on his monitor flatten completely. The moment the last pulse faded, the nurse reached over and turned off the alarm. The room fell still. It's strange how quiet death can be. No final breath, no movement, just an endless stillness. I remember thinking, as I removed my gloves, that death had claimed another victory in the most clinical way possible. We documented the time. 2:46 a.m. I walked out into the corridor, the fluorescent lights harsh against my eyes, and took a long breath. I told myself that was the end. But death, it seems, had other plans. 36 hours had passed since we pronounced Arif brain dead. His body lay in the ICU, sustained only by machines, the rhythmic sigh of the ventilator marking the passage of borrowed time. The nurses checked his vitals every few hours, not out of medical necessity, but out of habit. A ritual of respect, perhaps, for a life recently departed. His wife still sat beside him, refusing to leave. She would talk to him softly, reciting prayers, adjusting the blanket as if he were only asleep. Grief has a strange way of clinging to denial, and none of us had the heart to tell her to stop. It was early morning when the first nurse noticed it. She was documenting his vitals when she saw the faintest twitch in Arif's left hand. A reflex, she thought. The kind of involuntary movement that sometimes lingers after death. She made a note and continued her rounds. But when she returned an hour later, she saw it again, this time more deliberate, fingers curling as if trying to grasp something unseen. Her pulse quickened. She leaned closer, whispered his name, and then froze. His eyelids fluttered. Once, twice. And then, unmistakably, they opened. When she called me, I remember the disbelief in her voice. "Doctor, I think he's awake." I was halfway through a consultation, and for a moment I thought she had misspoken, but there was something in her tone that made me run. By the time I reached the ICU, 3 nurses were gathered around the bed. The air was thick with shock. His chest was rising and falling, not with the rhythm of the ventilator, but on its own. I stared at the monitor. His oxygen levels were stable. His pulse was strong. He was breathing independently. I ordered every test we could run. EEG, brainstem reflexes. Oxygenation levels, pupillary response. Each result contradicted the previous one, as though his body were rewriting its own rules. His EEG, which had been completely flat for over a day, now showed faint waves of activity. At first, I suspected an error, a misreading, a power issue, anything that could explain it within the laws of physiology. But everything checked out. The data was clean. The conclusion was impossible. Standing beside him, I spoke his name. "Arif, can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing. Then his eyes moved, slowly, heavily, until they met mine. It wasn't a random gaze. It was recognition. He blinked once, deliberately. My heart pounded in my chest, the rational part of my mind scrambling for footing. Reflex, seizure, misfiring neurons, any of those could explain a twitch. But this was different. He was there, the ICU filled with whispers. Some staff crossed themselves. Others just stared in silence, afraid to speak, afraid that words might break whatever fragile miracle was unfolding before them. I felt something I hadn't felt in years as a doctor, awe. It was the rare, humbling kind of awe that makes you question everything you know about your own field. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, raspy and slow. The nurse leaned in close, trying to catch the words. He looked at me and whispered, "I saw you crying." For a moment, the world stood still. I hadn't cried during the operation, not openly, but I remembered one moment, just after signing the death certificate, when I had paused by his bed, my eyes wet with exhaustion. No one else had been there. No one else had seen. I felt a chill run through me. I didn't know whether to call it a resurrection, a revival, or something beyond science entirely. All I knew was that a man we had declared gone was looking at me, alive, aware, and speaking. It wasn't just that he woke up. It was that he remembered everything. When Arif regained full consciousness, the room fell into an uneasy quiet. The medical team gathered around his bed, each of us expecting confusion, amnesia, or perhaps the fragile emptiness that follows prolonged coma. But Arif's eyes were lucid, startlingly aware. He looked at the tubes, the machines, the hospital ceiling, and then at me. There was no panic in his gaze, only a kind of calm that felt almost otherworldly. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what he was trying to describe. "I wasn't gone," he whispered. "I remember everything." I asked him gently what he meant. His wife stood frozen beside him, her hand clasped over her mouth. Arif took a long breath, his words halting but deliberate. He said that the moment his body collapsed, he felt himself rising, not metaphorically, but literally, lifting away from the pain. He described floating above the hospital bed, looking down at the frantic doctors and nurses working on him. He said he saw me shouting orders, saw his wife crying in the hallway, saw his own body lying motionless beneath a bright light. Every detail matched the events, exactly as they happened. I felt a cold wave pass through me. There was no way he could have known any of that. He went on to describe what came next. After what felt like hours, watching from above, everything went dark, and then there was light, soft, golden, and endless. He said he was walking through what looked like a field that stretched beyond sight, filled with a quiet so pure it didn't feel like silence, but peace itself. There was no pain, no fear. He said he saw someone standing in that light, his mother, who had passed away years earlier. "She smiled at me," he said, his eyes glistening. "She told me I didn't belong there yet." I listened carefully, my mind wrestling between wonder and skepticism. I had read about near-death experiences, studied them even. Science offers theories, oxygen deprivation. Our death experiences, studied them even. Science offers theories, oxygen deprivation, hallucinations from a dying brain, surges of the chemical DMT creating vivid imagery. But his EEG had been flatlined for hours. No brain activity, no possible neural mechanism for these sensations to form. The data didn't match the story. And yet, there he was, describing it all with a clarity and serenity I couldn't explain. When he spoke about coming back, his tone changed. He said there was a voice, neither male nor female, that spoke only a few words. "You're not done." The next thing he remembered was the sound of the ventilator, the brightness of the ICU lights, and the sight of my face above him. He said it was as if he had been pushed through a doorway back into a body that suddenly felt too heavy for him. "It hurt," he said softly. "My coming back hurt more than dying." In that moment, I didn't know what to say. The doctor and me wanted to find an explanation, to analyze it through the lens of biology and brain chemistry. But another part of me, the part that had watched his lifeless form and signed his death certificate, knew there was something beyond the charts and monitors happening here. His voice was steady, his recollection detailed, and his eyes had that unmistakable look of someone who had seen something the rest of us could not. For the first time in my career, I felt my certainty fracture. Medicine could explain heartbeats, neurons, and synapses. But what about consciousness? What about the moments when life seems to reach beyond its boundaries and return with a story no science can contain? I looked at Arif lying there, alive against all odds, and whispered to myself the truth I hadn't said aloud. I couldn't explain what I was seeing. Not this time. The days following Arif's awakening were unlike anything I had ever experienced in my medical career. The hospital became a storm of whispers. Nurses spoke about miracles in the corridors. Doctors debated theories in the cafeteria, and journalists began calling, having somehow caught wind of the story. But for me, everything felt suspended between disbelief and awe. I spent every spare moment reviewing his charts, rechecking the data, consulting colleagues across neurology, cardiology, even psychiatry. Every test told the same story. No anomaly, no hidden medical explanation. Arif's body had simply restarted, as if the boundary between death and life had momentarily bent to let him through. But what unsettled me most wasn't the revival. It was his behavior afterward. Arif was different, calmer, slower in speech, but with a kind of depth that made everyone stop and listen when he talked. He didn't seem afraid anymore, not of pain, not of dying, not even of uncertainty. He said he remembered every sensation from that other place, the warmth, the peace, the voice that sent him back. It's strange, he told me, but I feel like I've already lived through what everyone fears most. His words lingered with me long after I left his room. The medical community's reaction was split. Some dismissed it as a rare misdiagnosis of brain death, citing minute electrical flickers that might have gone unnoticed. Others argued it was a case of spontaneous return of circulation, what's clinically called Lazarus syndrome. But none of those theories could explain his awareness during the period of flatline, nor the precise memories of events that occurred while his body lay motionless. I presented the case in a neurology forum, hoping for clarity. Instead, I found more questions. A senior neurologist told me, "Doctor, if this is true, it doesn't just challenge medicine, it challenges our definition of consciousness itself." Outside the hospital, the story spread like wildfire. Strangers sent letters calling Arif the man who came back. Some saw him as proof of life beyond death, others as a symbol of divine intervention. But Arif himself rejected all of that attention. He didn't claim to have been to heaven or to have met angels. He simply said he went somewhere real, somewhere peaceful, and returned with a message he couldn't quite put into words. "Maybe," he said one day, "it wasn't for me to explain. Maybe it was for you to witness." His recovery was remarkable. Within weeks, he began walking again, his speech fully coherent, his memory intact. We ran cognitive tests, neuroimaging, and psychological evaluations, all normal. No brain damage, no hallucination patterns. It was as though the event had healed him rather than harmed him. When he was finally discharged, he shook my hand and said, "Doctor, don't let this scare you. Let it remind you that not everything alive can be measured by machines." That night, I sat alone in my office, staring at his EEG scans, the flat line that should have been final, followed by the faint flicker of life that defied reason. I realized that for all our progress, medicine is still a candle in a vast darkness, illuminating only a fraction of what life and death truly are. For the first time, I felt small not in defeat, but in wonder. There are mysteries even the sharpest minds must bow before, and maybe that's where healing begins. Not in what we know, but in what we humbly accept we don't. Years have passed since that night, yet not a single day goes by without my mind drifting back to Arif, the man who came back from the silence. I've treated hundreds of patients since, given lectures, published papers, even been invited to speak about consciousness and the limits of medical science. But whenever I look at the bright images of the brain projected on screens, I can't help but feel they're only fragments, tiny reflections of something much greater, something we still don't understand. Science insists that consciousness ceases when brain activity stops. But if that were true, how did Arif remember moments that occurred while his brain was clinically silent? How did he recall my voice breaking when I spoke to his family? Those questions linger like a low hum at the back of my thoughts, unresolved, unrelenting. I often revisit that room in my memory. The ICU with its cold, humming machines, the soft rhythm of ventilators, the dim light flickering on sterile tiles. That was where I first learned the limits of control. Medicine teaches you that the body is a system, that death is final, that revival beyond a certain point is impossible. Yet what I witnessed that night didn't fit any textbook. It felt as though life itself had paused. And then, for reasons beyond our reach, decided to return. I've replayed the moment of his eyes opening countless times. The slow, deliberate blink, the faint movement of his lips forming my name. It still sends a shiver through me, not from fear, but from reverence. Arif and I stayed in touch for a while after his recovery. He seemed to move through the world differently, no longer hurried, no longer anxious about the future. He told me once that he no longer feared death, that he had seen what waits beyond worry. When I asked him to describe it again, hoping for new details, he only smiled and said, "Doctor, maybe some truths can't survive being explained. They can only be felt." A year later, he moved to a quieter town, away from cameras and reporters. The last message I received from him was simple: "Thank you for not giving up." I never saw him again. Now, sometimes late at night, I find myself standing by the same hospital window where I once questioned everything. The city lights below pulse like a living organism, each flicker reminding me of how fragile yet persistent life is. I think about how close we all are to that invisible line, how one breath separates here from there, sound from silence, the known from the unknown. And I wonder whether consciousness truly ends when the brain stops, or whether it merely changes form, slipping into a dimension our instruments cannot yet measure. In the end, I've come to accept that not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some are meant to haunt us, to humble us, to remind us that science is not the opposite of wonder, but its closest companion. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint echo of the heart monitor from that night. The sound that should have marked an ending, but instead whispered of something beginning anew. Maybe the human spirit is not confined by biology after all. Maybe, just maybe, there are moments when the universe bends its own rules to remind us that we are more than flesh and neurons. And that thought still haunts me.